Have you ever played God of War and thought, you know what, this game is too masculine, it needs a female lead instead? That's right, here we go again, a beloved decades-old gaming franchise with a male lead who has defined it since the very beginning. Millions of fans who love it exactly as it is, and a rumour still unconfirmed but entirely believable given the current climate, that someone in a glass-walled office somewhere in California has decided the whole thing needs a woman in charge, because apparently that is the only thing left on the creative menu at certain studios right now. According to a recent tweet from Pirate Nation on X, Sony Santa Monica's next God of War title may not star Kratos at all, with the lead reportedly being Faye, the wife of Kratos from the Norse saga, and with a gameplay style leaning further into pure action than the recent entries. According to a leaker, Nate the Hate 2, Sony's plan is apparently to reveal the game in 2026 with a first half 2027 release window, and a now deleted LinkedIn post from a former senior writer at Santa Monica, which was screenshot and then posted on Reset Era, claims they helped shape the narrative vision for what they describe as a new franchise within the God of War universe. And just to add a little more fuel to the speculation fire, Christopher Judge, the voice of Kratos, recently said that his next video game announcement is coming this summer, which tells us something significant is on the horizon, even if we don't know exactly what shape it takes yet. So something is definitely being cooked up behind closed doors, but did anyone in that kitchen stop to ask whether the people who have been eating at this restaurant for the last 20 years actually wanted to have the menu changed? I am Lady Decade, and if you like your gaming industry coverage straight, honest and completely free of corporate spin, hit that subscribe button, because today we are talking about the God of War female lead rumour, what it represents, and why, if it turns out to be true, it is yet another entry in a pattern that gamers are completely and utterly exhausted by. The AAA gaming landscape is messy right now, but fortunately not everything out there is trying to lecture you or dismantle the things you love. So use my links below to get 32% off Resident Evil Requiem, 92% off the amazing Streets of Rage 4, 36% off Marvel Cosmic Invasion, as well as discounts of up to 90% on thousands of modern releases. Every purchase supports this channel, and if you really love what I do, my behind the scenes cosplay library and more are waiting for you over on my Lady Decades Patreon. Right then, let's get into it. To really take in how ridiculous a pivot to a female lead in God of War truly is, we need to go back to the beginning. God of War began in 2005 on the PlayStation 2. It was brutal, operatic, and 1,000,000% masculine, telling the story of Kratos, a Spartan warrior driven by rage and betrayal and a mythological capacity for violence. A character who tore gods apart with his bare hands and climbed the body of a living titan as a level, and who was in every meaningful sense an icon of the traditional male power fantasy in gaming. And just to be clear, there is absolutely nothing wrong with that, because male power fantasy is a legitimate and beloved genre with an enormous audience that has always shown up for it enthusiastically, and it deserves to be respected. More recently, the 2018 reboot did something genuinely remarkable in that it evolved Kratos beautifully, adding emotional depth and fatherhood and a more complicated kind of grief to the mix without ever abandoning what the character fundamentally is at his core. And Ragnarok continued that evolution with equal skill and care. The franchise's identity has always been built around this specific character and his specific journey, his rage, his guilt, his redemption arc played out across two entire mythological pantheons. And crucially, the audience understood that and invested in it and showed up for it in enormous numbers for 2 whole decades. God of War 2018 sold over 23 million copies and Ragnarok sold over 15 million, which means this is emphatically not a franchise that is struggling to connect with an audience or in desperate need of a creative overhaul to find its footing. This is a franchise with one of the most devoted fan bases in all of gaming, a franchise that has been doing everything right, and yet here we apparently are seriously discussing the possibility of replacing the man at the centre of it all. They're saying Faye is set to be announced as the protagonist of the next God of War game, and in my opinion, the rumour is as concerning as it is plausible, not because Faye is a bad character or anything like that, she absolutely is not, but because replacing established male leads with female ones in long-running franchises has become, in 2026, one of the most predictable moves a California-based studio can make. It's so predictable that when a rumour like this surfaces, a significant portion of the gaming community does not even raise an eyebrow in surprise anymore. They simply just nod and think, yes, of course, this is exactly what they would do, because we have seen this particular playbook so many times now that we know every page of it off by heart. And that reflexive, weary recognition is itself the whole problem in miniature, because something that should feel like a bold creative swing has instead become shorthand for a corporate agenda, and that reputational damage is entirely self-inflicted by an industry that has chosen politics over craft one too many times. Because you lot up in those California offices making these decisions have done this so many times now that the audience can see every move before you make it, and it stopped being subversive or interesting or progressive a very long time ago. It's not a brave artistic statement in 2026 to take a franchise built around a beloved male character and then hand the lead to a woman instead. I love games with female leads, I genuinely love them, but I refuse to let this argument become misrepresented as something it's not. What I do not love is when the replacement feels like it has been mandated from above rather than arrived at organically through the creative process. And what I really do not love is when the female characters created under those mandates are deliberately stripped of their femininity, designed to be visually unappealing and presented in a way that seems almost aggressive in its determination to be unlike the kind of female characters that audiences have historically responded to with warmth and enthusiasm, because the uglification of female video game characters is a real and well-documented phenomenon in recent years, and it's not something that players have ever asked for, and it's not something that they have ever embraced. And it has caused genuine and justified frustration across a community that used to be able to look at a game's character design and simply feel excited. A male power fantasy replaced by a female lead who has been specifically designed to look like no one would ever find her attractive is not progressive or artistically interesting, and it is absolutely not what the people who comprise the God of War fanbase for over the last 20 years were hoping for when they imagined the future of the franchise they love. There are moments in franchise history where a change in the protagonist feels genuinely earned and narratively inevitable, and those transitions tend to be welcomed by audiences rather than resisted, because fans are actually very good at recognising when a creative choice has emerged from the story itself rather than from an external agenda. Atreus has been front and centre in both the 2018 game and Ragnarok, growing from a frightened child into a young man, grappling with a destiny he did not choose, and the idea of a game that places him at the centre makes enormous narrative sense as the organic next step in the story being told across this Norse saga. Players have watched him grow up, they have invested in his relationship with his father. An Atreus-led game would feel like a continuation, like the story following its own internal logic to its natural conclusion. A Faye-led game reads like a checkbox being ticked by people who have decided that the God of War universe needs a female lead, and have worked backwards from that conclusion to find a character who could plausibly fill the role. Faye is compelling within the existing games precisely because she is gone. Her absence is the wound around which the entire 2018 story is built, and the mystery of who she really was and what she knew adds texture and depth to everything Kratos and Atreus go through in her memory. Putting her at the centre of her own game does not deepen that mystery, it dissolves it, and in doing so it risks undermining the emotional architecture of the games that have already been made. None of that is so much about not wanting a female protagonist, it's about wanting creative decisions to come from the story rather than from a memo. So let's talk about who is actually responsible for the pattern we are describing, because it matters to understand the institutional context here. PlayStation's American division, the California-based side of the operation, has a track record at this point that genuinely deserves scrutiny, and the most obvious exhibit in that case is Concord, a game that represents one of the most spectacular and instructive failures in recent gaming history. And what was Concord really? It was a game whose character roster had been so thoroughly processed through DEI frameworks that it became the subject of widespread mockery before it even launched. Not because it featured a diverse cast of characters, plenty of genuinely beloved games do, because that in itself is never really the issue, but because the diversity felt like the product itself, rather than a natural characteristic of a world that the creative team had actually built with love and care. The characters were visually unappealing in ways that felt deliberately engineered, and the designs were committee approved rather than inspired. And the overall impression was of a game that had been made for an audience of approving executives rather than for the people who were expected to pay 40 quid for it. Players can always tell the difference between a character who exists because an artist was excited to create them and a character who exists. After all, a document said there needed to be one, and the Concord roster had document written all over it. Sony's American division looked at all of that and then apparently concluded that the lesson to carry forward was insufficient boldness rather than catastrophic misjudgment, which tells you a great deal about the institutional culture in that building. Because this is the thing about the so-called modern audience. It's a phantom demographic that has been haunting California-based game development for the better part of a decade now. This imaginary cohort of progressive-minded consumers who are allegedly out there somewhere with their wallets open, desperately waiting for a reimagining of a franchise they never particularly cared about in the first place, ready to flood the sales charts the moment a studio finally dares to put a woman in charge of something that's previously starred a man. Studios have been chasing this audience through multiple console generations at this point, spending extraordinary amounts of money on projects designed to appeal to them, and the audience keeps not showing up. Because the audience was never real to begin with. It was a projection, a wishful fiction constructed from social media metrics and focus groups, and the genuinely but extremely small voice of a very online political community that does not represent the broader gaming public in any statistically meaningful way. Concord proved that the modern audience does not exist. Suicide Squad Killed the Justice League proved it as well. Every live service game built around representation metrics rather than around the simple question of whether it's actually fun to play, and which has failed in the last 3 years, has collectively proven it over and over in terms that should be impossible to ignore. Real audiences, the ones who have been showing up for God of War since 2005, who pay for PlayStation Plus year after year, who have made this franchise one of the defining success stories of the medium, have demonstrated with extraordinary consistency and clarity exactly what they want, which is good games, compelling characters, and creative work that respects the identity of the franchise they have spent years loving. That is genuinely the whole list, and it is not a complicated ask. You don't get to repeatedly ignore that message, watch project after project collapse under the weight of its own ideological scaffolding, and then come back for another go at one of your most successful and beloved franchises without the audience noticing the pattern, because we do notice, and we have noticed for quite some time now. To be clear, I love games with female leads. I love Tomb Raider, and I think Lara Croft, as many of you who've been watching my channel know, is one of the most iconic characters in the history of the medium, a character who has earned her place over 30 years of games through consistent creative investment and genuine audience affection rather than through mandate or replacement. I love Stellar Blade, which was released in 2024 by the South Korean studio Shift Up and received enormous commercial and critical success precisely because it was built with a clear and delightful creative vision, because its protagonist Eve was designed to be beautiful and appealing and exciting in ways that certain corners of the industry have apparently decided are problematic, and because the game respected its audience rather than lecturing them. a bit of a hot take here, but I even think that Aloy from the Horizon franchise is a well-written character in a beautifully crafted world, at least in Zero Dawn. I think there is an enormous and genuinely enthusiastic audience for games featuring well-designed female protagonists, and the commercial performance of games like those I've just mentioned demonstrates that with total clarity. The success of those games is actually the most devastating possible argument against the approach being taken by studios like the one that's made Concord, because it proves beyond any reasonable doubt that audiences are not resistant to female leads. They are resistant to ideologically compromised games that happen to feature female leads, which is a very different thing, and conflating those two positions is either an act of intellectual dishonesty or a sign that the person doing the conflating has not been paying close enough attention to the actual feedback they have been receiving from their audience for the last several years, which raises another question. What would a good version of expanding the God of War franchise actually look like? Because I think it is worth being as constructive here as I am critical. So let me explain. If Sony Santa Monica wants to expand the God of War universe beyond Kratos, there are creative paths that would genuinely feel exciting rather than transparently agenda-driven, and the most obvious one is already apparently in development, with reports suggesting a more action-oriented title set in ancient Greece, exploring a younger Kratos and his relationship with Zeus. That sounds genuinely interesting to me because it is a story that emerges naturally from the mythology the franchise has already established. It deepens rather than replaces what we already know, and it comes from a place of wanting to explore the world rather than from a place of wanting to make a statement about who should be allowed to be the protagonist of a major franchise. If they want to give Atreus his own game as the next chapter in the Norse saga story, that also makes complete narrative sense, and would likely be embraced warmly by a fanbase that has watched that character grow for 2 full games and has genuine emotional investment in where he ends up. What feels like it comes from a very different and much less creatively honest place is taking Faye, a character whose power in the existing games derives specifically from her absence and her mystery, and building a game around her in order to ensure the franchise has a female lead, because that decision is transparently working backwards from a conclusion rather than forwards from a story. And audiences in 2026 have developed an extremely finely tuned instinct for exactly that kind of reverse-engineered creative agenda. And the tragedy of all of this, and it genuinely is a tragedy from the perspective of someone who loves games and wants the industry to thrive, is that Sony PlayStation as a broader organisation has demonstrated extraordinary creative range and genuine artistic ambition across its first-party catalogue. The Japanese side of PlayStation in particular has a track record that is the envy of the industry, and the God of War franchise itself, under Cory Barlog's creative vision, produced 2 of the most genuinely acclaimed games of the last decade. The craft and the talent are absolutely there, and nobody is arguing otherwise, but craft and talent mean nothing when they are being directed towards the wrong creative goals by institutional priorities that have nothing to do with making the best possible game and everything to do with satisfying an internal cultural agenda that the actual paying audience never signed up for. The people who need to understand this most urgently are the ones in those California offices, who are apparently still operating under the impression that audiences will eventually come around, and that the resistance is just a noisy vocal minority rather than a broad and consistent signal from the people who actually fund this industry with their purchases, and that the way to turn things around is to keep making the same kinds of decisions that produced Concord and then wonder why the sales numbers look the way they do. We're not coming around because there's nothing to come around to. We simply want good games that respect the creative identities of the franchises that we love, designed by people who are making decisions for creative reasons rather than for political reasons, featuring characters who exist because artists were genuinely excited to create them rather than because a diversity and inclusion target needed to be met. That is not an unreasonable position. That's not bigotry or gatekeeping or any other word that gets thrown around to avoid engaging with the actual argument. That is just what it looks like to be a person who loves this medium and wants it to be treated with the respect it deserves. No matter what you or I think, God of War stands as one of PlayStation's crown jewels, earned over 20 years of exceptional creative work and built on the trust and enthusiasm of a fan base that has been remarkably loyal and generous with its time and money across multiple console generations. It deserves to be treated with the corresponding level of respect, which means creative decisions about its future should be driven by what serves the story and the audience rather than by what sends a particular cultural signal to a particular internal constituency. And if the people responsible for its future genuinely understands that, then the next entry in this franchise has the potential to be every bit as extraordinary as the games that came before it. But if the Faye rumour is true, and it turns out that this choice was made for the reasons most of us suspect, rather than for genuine creative ones, then Sony's American division will have demonstrated once again that they have not learned the lesson that Concord wrote in letters $200 million high. The audience will respond accordingly, because we always do. We will always keep responding accordingly for as long as it is necessary, because ultimately the only language that cuts through in this industry is commercial reality. Commercial reality has been making the same argument with remarkable consistency for several years now. We are watching, we are informed, and we remember Concord, and we already have our wallets ready, just not necessarily in the way that you are counting on. Don't forget you can use my links below to get 32% off Resident Evil Requiem, 92% off the amazing Streets of Rage 4, 36% off Marvel Cosmic Invasion, as well as discounts of up to 90% off thousands of modern releases. And if you really love what I do, my behind the scenes cosplay library and more are waiting for you over on my Lady Decades Patreon. I'll see you all again very soon.